Brother got the house. I got a handshake and a post-it note that said, "Good luck out there." I'm not exaggerating. There was an actual post-it note. Yellow. My mother's handwriting, the loopy kind she uses when she's trying to seem casual about something that isn't casual at all. She'd stuck it to a manila envelope containing exactly $0 and a printout of a Craigslist apartment listing in a zip code I'd never heard of. My brother Elliot got a 4-bedroom colonial in Naperville with a finished basement and a 2-car garage. He's 38. He still calls our parents every Sunday to report on the weather. I'm Mara. I'm 31. I've been the responsible one my entire life, which, it turns out, is a role that comes with no benefits, no retirement package, and no real estate. Let me go back. I was 7 when I first understood that something in our house was tilted. Not broken, not obviously wrong, just slightly off level. The way a table wobbles and you don't notice until you set a glass of water on it. Elliot was 10, and he'd failed his 3rd grade reading assessment for the 2nd time. My mother sat with him at the kitchen table every night for 2 weeks, flashcards spread between them, her voice patient and warm in a way it went when she was really trying. I watched from the hallway. I had already been reading chapter books for a year. Nobody sat with me at the kitchen table. I didn't need it, so I didn't get it. That was the beginning of what I would spend the next 2 decades calling the system. It was never spoken out loud. Nobody announced it, but the rules were clear if you paid attention. Elliot needed more, so Elliot got more. I was fine, so I was left to be fine. By high school, I'd figured out how to work within the system. I kept my grades up because asking for a tutor wasn't something I did. I got a part-time job at 16 hostessing at a diner on Route 59 because my parents had told me, quietly, that they were saving money for Elliot's learning support program. I didn't argue. I bought my own prom dress. I drove myself to the ACT. I applied to colleges mostly on my own, with some help from a school counselor named Mrs. Petrova, who remembered my name, which put her ahead of a lot of people. I got into the University of Illinois. Partial scholarship, the rest in loans. My parents gave me $600 and a used comforter that smelled faintly of cedar. Elliot, 3 years later, enrolled in a for-profit trade school that cost my parents $40,000 over 2 years. He dropped out after 14 months. I graduated in 4 years. I moved to Chicago. I got a job doing administrative work at a mid-sized accounting firm and then worked my way into an analyst position over 3 years. I paid my loans on schedule. I built a small emergency fund. I did all the things you're supposed to do, which nobody noticed, because the things you're supposed to do are invisible. The things Elliot did were very visible. He totaled his first car at 23, and my parents bought him another one. He got evicted from his apartment at 25 and moved back home, which stretched into 4 years. He got into a fender bender in the second car, and my parents added him to their insurance without telling him what that cost them, because telling him would have made him feel bad. At 29, he got engaged to a woman named Kayla, who I genuinely liked. She was sharp and funny, and seemed slightly baffled by my family, in the same way I'd always been slightly baffled by my family, and my parents threw them an engagement party that cost, by my rough estimate, somewhere around $30,000. When I got engaged at 28, there was a dinner. Just the 5 of us, plus my then-fiancé Derek. My mother made lasagna. It was a good lasagna. That's genuinely not a complaint. But there was no party. There were no decorations. My mother did say, "We're so happy for you two," and she meant it, I think. She just meant it in a quieter register than she used for Elliot. Derek and I planned our own wedding. We paid for almost all of it ourselves. My parents contributed $1,500, which I was grateful for. Elliot's wedding cost my parents, according to a number my father mentioned once and then immediately seemed to regret mentioning, around $22,000. I wasn't supposed to do the math, but I am a financial analyst. Doing math is specifically what I do. Anyway, that's the background. That's the table wobbling for 24 years. Now here's where the glass finally falls off. Last March, my parents sold the house in Naperville, the house I grew up in, the one my grandfather helped them buy in 1989. The one with the oak tree in the backyard that still had a rusted hook in it from a tire swing I used to love. They'd been talking about downsizing for a couple of years, my dad's knees, my mom wanting less yard, the usual, and I supported it completely. It made sense. I helped them research senior communities. I drove out on a Saturday in February and helped them go through closets and decide what to donate. I was there. The house sold for $460,000. After paying off the remaining mortgage and closing costs, my parents netted somewhere in the neighborhood of $380,000. My mother called me on a Tuesday evening in April. I was making dinner, half listening, the phone on speaker while I chopped onions. She told me they had decided how they wanted to handle the proceeds. She said it in the tone people use when they've rehearsed something. She said they were giving Elliot $320,000. They were keeping $60,000 for themselves as a cushion. She paused. She said they wanted me to know they loved me equally, and that they knew I was capable and had always landed on my feet, and that they hoped I understood. I stood there with a knife in my hand and an onion half chopped on the cutting board. I said, "What about me?" My mother said, "Honey, you've always been the strong one." I put the knife down, not dramatically. I just didn't trust myself to keep holding it while I was processing what had just been said to me. She kept talking. She said Elliot had more needs. He and Kayla had 2 kids now, and the expenses. She said they knew I had Derek and a good job, and we'd be fine. She said it wasn't that they loved me less. She said, "You know how it's always been," in a tone that was somehow meant to be comforting. "You know how it's always been." As if the way things had always been was a natural law rather than a series of choices they had made, repeatedly, for 30 years. I told her I needed to go. I hung up. I sat down on the kitchen floor, which I don't think I've ever done before or since, and I stayed there for about 10 minutes. Derek found me there when he came in from the garage. He sat down on the floor next to me without asking questions first, which is one of the reasons I married him. I told him what she'd said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's not okay, Mara." Not angry, not explosive, just clear. It helped. I spent the next 3 days thinking about what I wanted to do. I want to be honest about what I considered. I considered saying nothing, swallowing it, telling myself it didn't matter because I was fine. I had done that before. I was good at it. I also considered calling my parents and saying everything I'd spent 30 years not saying in one long detonation of a phone call. I considered both ends, and then I tried to find something in the middle that was true. What I landed on was this: I wasn't going to pretend it was okay, but I also wasn't going to blow up in a way I'd regret. I wanted to be understood, not just heard. I called my father first, because in my family, my father is the one who listens before he defends. I asked him to explain the reasoning to me like I was a stranger, not their daughter. Not the strong one, not the one who lands on her feet, just a person who wanted to understand how the numbers got to where they got. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "We didn't think you'd need it the way he does." I said, "That's not the same as what I asked." He didn't have another answer. I said, "I want you to understand something. I've been supporting myself since I was 16. I paid for my own college with loans I'm still paying off. I've never asked you for anything because the message I received, my entire childhood, was that asking wasn't for me. That's not independence, Dad. That's what happens when a kid learns that the door isn't open for her." I wasn't yelling. I want to be clear about that. I was very calm, which somehow felt harder than yelling. He said, "We never meant for you to feel that way." I said, "I know, but I did." And this is the same thing happening one more time. We stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes. It wasn't a resolution. It was more like the first time we had ever actually talked about the real thing instead of around it. My mother was harder. She went immediately to the emotions. "You're breaking my heart. I can't believe you see us this way. Your brother has struggles you don't understand." And I have to keep returning to the actual subject, the way you keep steering a car that keeps drifting. I said, "I'm not asking you to love me more than him. I'm asking you to explain why my entire life you operated as though my not needing help was the same as not deserving any." She cried. I let her cry. I didn't apologize for making her cry. She said she needed time to think. I said, "Okay." I meant it. I wasn't issuing an ultimatum. I genuinely wanted her to think. What I decided after both conversations was that I was going to change one thing in my own behavior. That I had the power to change. I was going to stop being available in the ways I'd always been available that had never been acknowledged. I stopped driving out to help on weekends without asking what specifically was needed. I stopped answering calls that came while I was at work, unless they were actual emergencies. I let Elliot be the one who figured out how to help my parents with their new condo's internet setup and their new Medicare supplement paperwork and all the other logistical pieces I had always just absorbed without comment. The first month, my mother called 6 times more than usual. A lot of the calls were small. Questions she could Google, updates she could text. I answered some of them. I didn't answer others. I wasn't punishing her. I was just no longer treating my own time as infinitely available. What surprised me was what happened with Elliot. He called me in June. Elliot doesn't call me. We're not close in the easy, natural way. We're close in the way people who grew up in the same house are close, which means we share a language without necessarily sharing much else. He called and he was uncharacteristically quiet at first, and then he said, "Mom seems off. Are you guys okay?" I told him what I told our parents. Not the whole thing, but the substance of it. The inheritance, the pattern, what I'd said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't know it was that bad for you." I believed him. That was the strange part. I believed him completely. He hadn't been calculating. He'd just been the one who needed things and had gotten them, and he'd never had any particular reason to look at the shape of what I wasn't getting. That's the thing about being the kid in a family who gets more. It doesn't necessarily make you a bad person. It just means nobody ever handed you a mirror. I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "That doesn't make it okay." I said, "No, it doesn't." We talked for almost an hour. It was the most honest conversation Elliot and I have ever had. At the end, he said he thought our parents should do something to make it right. He didn't say what. I didn't ask him to push them. I wasn't trying to recruit him. In August, my parents asked Derek and me to come to dinner. My mom made pot roast, which is her apology food. I've known this since I was 12. We sat at their small dining table in the new condo, which is nice and fits them well and has a view of a pond that my mother clearly loves, and after dinner, my father put a piece of paper on the table. It was a check. It wasn't $320,000. It wasn't equal. I want to be honest about that. It was $45,000. My father said they had talked, and that they understood they hadn't been fair, and that this was what they could do right now. My mother said, "We're sorry we made you feel like you didn't matter." She didn't say sorry we weren't fair, she said sorry we made you feel. And I noticed the difference, but I also noticed that she was trying, and that trying, from my mother, is not nothing. I didn't cry. I thanked them. I folded the check and put it in my purse, and later Derek and I sat in the car for a few minutes before driving home, and I let myself feel all of it. The relief, the grief, the weird mix of gratitude and anger that doesn't cancel itself out no matter how long you wait. $45,000 is not the same as $320,000. I'm not going to pretend the math is fixed. But the conversation happened. The acknowledgement happened. That's not nothing either. Here's what I know now that I didn't know when I was standing in my kitchen with a knife and a half-chopped onion. Being the capable one, the one who lands on her feet, the one who doesn't make waves. That's not a compliment when it's used as a reason to give you less. Capability is not a forfeit. Self-sufficiency that you developed because no door was open for you is not the same as not needing a door. The families who do this, and I know from the messages I've gotten that there are so many families who do this, are not always doing it out of malice. Sometimes they're just operating on an autopilot that nobody ever thought to question. That doesn't mean you have to accept the output of that autopilot forever. I'm still in my parents' lives. I want to be clear about that. I didn't cut anyone off. I didn't issue demands. What I did was stop participating in a fiction, the fiction that I was fine with how things had always been, that I didn't notice, that it hadn't cost me anything. The cost was real. I'm done pretending otherwise. The oak tree in the backyard of the old house is someone else's oak tree now. I drove past the house once, in October, just to look at it. New family, minivan in the driveway, a basketball hoop someone had put up near the garage. The rusted hook in the oak tree was gone. Maybe they'd had it removed. Maybe it had finally just fallen out on its own. I sat in my car for a minute, and then I drove home to my own life, which I built myself, which is mine, and which nobody gets to tell me I don't deserve. I've thought a lot about what actually changed the day my mother called me. Not the money. The money was almost secondary by the time I'd sat on that kitchen floor long enough to feel my legs go numb. What changed was that I stopped being able to pretend I hadn't noticed. That's the thing nobody tells you about being the capable one in a family. The role doesn't just happen to you. You participate in it. Every time I said nothing, every time I paid my own way without comment, every time I watched Elliot get help I'd never asked for and told myself it was fine, I was casting a vote for the system to continue. I wasn't a passive victim of it. I was, in my own quiet way, maintaining it. That's not self-blame. It's just true. And recognizing it was the first step toward actually changing something. The cause and the effect, when I look back now, are almost embarrassingly clear. 30 years of demonstrating that I would handle things on my own produced 30 years of being left to handle things on my own. Not because my parents are monsters. They aren't. They're just people who took the path of least resistance over and over until the path became a groove, became a canyon. But every action has a consequence, including the action of never speaking up. The consequence of my silence was being made invisible. The consequence of finally speaking was being seen, imperfectly and incompletely, but seen. What I want people to take from Mara's story, from my story, is this. Intelligence without honesty is just a more sophisticated way of lying to yourself. I was smart enough to see exactly what was happening in my family from the time I was 7 years old. I understood the system. I could have mapped it on a whiteboard. But for decades, I used that intelligence to manage my own feelings about it rather than to address it. That's not wisdom. That's just survival with extra steps. The real turn came when I decided that understanding something and accepting something are not the same thing. You can understand why your parents made the choices they made, their own histories, their blind spots, the way Elliot's visible struggles were easier to respond to than my invisible ones, and still say, this was not okay, and I'm not going to act like it was. Strength isn't the absence of need. Derek said something to me once, somewhere in the middle of all of this, that I keep coming back to. He said that the people who are told they're strong from a young age often just become very good at hiding how much things cost them. That's not strength. That's a performance of strength that exhausts the performer. Real strength, I think, is being honest about what something cost you even when the people who caused the cost weren't trying to hurt you. It's saying I deserved more than a post-it note, not because you're demanding anything, but because it's simply true and you finally refuse to live inside the lie that it isn't. The $45,000 check my father put on that table didn't fix everything. It wasn't supposed to. What it did was confirm that the truth, when spoken calmly and clearly and without apology, can move people, even people who have been unmoved for 30 years. Not always, not completely. But enough. I drove past the old house once after everything. Someone else's basketball hoop in the driveway. Someone else's kids, probably, bouncing around inside. I didn't feel sad about the house exactly. I felt something more like relief. That the version of me who learned to disappear inside those walls had finally figured out how to take up space. That's the only inheritance I needed. I just had to claim it myself.